which will be a week from Wednesday, so we're 2 weeks away yet from the test, or almost 2 weeks away from the test. I have study sheets though that I'm going to hand out for you guys to start looking things up, finding things in your book. This next test will have image identification. That means that in your book, if I can borrow this, thank you. In your book, there are pictures that are associated with the lectures that we're doing. So any place where you see the name on the list, you need to make sure that you're knowing the images in the book that are associated with that name. So anytime you see like Vienna Workshop or Vienna Secession, these kinds of images are the images that I'm looking for you guys to recognize on the test. There will be questions and images that will show those. So please make sure that you know the images that are associated. This goes with Charles Rennie Mackintosh. This goes with Charles Rennie Mackintosh and the Glasgow Four. So make sure that you're using your book. Thank you. Using your book to identify the images per the list here that we have. Thank you. Okay, are there any questions on that? So this should give you plenty of heads up to be studying, to be looking at. There are some things that we haven't covered yet on here, like the traits of Art Nouveau. But the ideals of the arts and crafts movement, can anybody tell me what those are? What are the ideals of the arts and crafts list?
Everything handmade.
Mm-hmm. Yep, that's one of them. What else?
Complete work of art.
Complete work of art. Anything else? What do you think?
Stop going forward.
Yeah. Stay. Keep thinking backwards. Going backwards to old time thinking. What else?
So it's sort of like almost like middle-age retro. That's what I could put it.
Yeah, I'd agree. And in many ways, it's preserving the past is really what it comes down to. So those are some of the things that they are looking at, especially the things of the past that they're looking at are before the Renaissance. So things of the medieval period, chivalry, and admiring women from a distance, and being gallant, and all of that stuff are things that they are playing with. Even the fashions that they started to put women into as part of the pre-Raphaelite movement are really like left over from the 14th century, if you look back at it. So you'll see that the same kind of dresses that they wore when they were hanging out at Red House are the same kind of dresses they would have worn back in the 14th century. So in any case, that's the traits. And then the rest of the stuff are things that we're covering now. So we've already covered William Morris. We are now looking at the Glasgow Four. We talked about Versacrum. We talked about the Vienna Secession and Gustav Klimt. So there's a lot of other names here that we haven't covered yet, but we're getting there. So, but don't be afraid to read your book and to get yourself caught up on that. With that in mind, we're going to do the question of the day, and today I'm going to call on people that haven't asked questions yet, so that everybody is getting some kind of points on the board for this. So, I know that you have difficulty with the language, but do you have a question of the day that you can share with us? No? Okay. All right. See if you can muster up the courage for the next class to have a question ready for the class. Okay. All right. Anthony, do you have a question of the day? Is that a no?
No.
Same thing for you. Muster up some courage and get that question together. Jessica.
What were the salons used for mainly?
Okay. What was the reason that they had salons back in the day of the Vienna Secessionists? Do you know?
To discuss like higher education and thoughts and stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's meant to be very cerebral. So, Jessica, did you have anything else to add to that?
Nope.
Did you have anything else to add to that treat?
No.
Adam?
Yeah, it's almost like a precursor during the Revolutionary War. They had these things called like penny colleges, where basically the tea houses or the coffee houses became sort of informal colleges because you know, drink the coffee, it'd be like a place for intellectual discourse.
Yeah, can we see any present day equivalents to salons?
Yeah, I guess they're more like think tanks now. They're formally organized. You know,
Okay.
you name your political
Yeah.
association, like the Cato Group, or
Yeah,
like
sure.
there's a libertarian one and there's a liberal one. I mean, across and there's a spectrum.
Yeah, it doesn't even have to be that deep. Which can you think of?
Coffee houses?
Yeah, like Starbucks. People just kind of congregate there to hang out, to maybe play games or to have conversations or even just like hang out and do social media from their social media. Our social media today is their social media of the past. So instead of like writing letters to people across the spectrum, they would actually be in the same room that they were doing this. But it's pretty much the same thing as what we had in the past. Liz, did you have anything else to add
Oh,
to
I was
this?
just gonna say another one could be like book clubs, meeting in libraries, discussing.
Exactly.
things like that.
Exactly. So places where people can gather to have intellectual conversations is really what it comes down to. And some people do that at bars, but today it's really like coffee houses that we see a lot of it. We also have meetup groups where people are finding like interests and they're doing the same thing. So I think those are two very good examples. All right, let's move into some other folks that haven't asked questions in a while. How about Mark?
Who were like all four of the members of Glasgow?
4 members of the Glasgow Four Liz.
Charles McIntosh, James Herbert McNair, Margaret MacDonald, and Francis McDonald.
Very good, she memorized those. Or did you
Oh.
memorize them? They're right there in her notes, she's got them right in front of her. But very good. Anything that you can add to that, Mark? No? Anything you want to add about the Glasgow Four?
The two men were architects and they became artists, designers. They all went to the same school of art and they had a really similar design style.
Very good, excellent, excellent.
It's sort of the medieval style. They kind of like, they recycled the castle kind of style.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I remember reading
so
about
this
some two
is-
together.
They are, their design is very, very influenced by Celtic design and
Yes.
from the baronial castles left over in the Scottish
Highlands.
Yeah, in the Scottish Highlands. So that was really a big influence on them. But they were also very influenced by William Morris and what he was doing. And in many regards, what they were doing was an extension, their own version, their own extension of what arts and crafts were. So they were an interesting group too. Let's see, I can't call on you because you weren't here the other day. Joseph, do you have any question of the day that you want to give us?
What were the versacrum,
What does versacrum mean? Yeah.
or what were they too?
What was versacrum? Kelly?
A magazine put out by the Vienna Secession.
Good, yes. And anything that you want to add to, I'm going to throw it to Joseph first, but anything you want to add to that
Like-
commentary?
Yeah, I mean, just how every page was unique on its own, like they never repeated.
Very good, yes,
What-
yes.
What's it mean Latin-wise? Is it Latin or Greek?
It's Latin.
Okay.
Kelly, do you want to tell us?
Sacred Spring.
I knew it was sacred something. Because for sacrament, I could figure that out. I didn't know what the other one was.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Anybody else have anything to add to the tale of versacrum? So the original story is based upon a Greek myth, of course. 'Cause that's what the Vienna Secession still a lot of. They were referencing Greek mythology. So in maybe I was wrong with that, anyhow. But in any case, it refers to a sacred spring that saved the lives of a village that was suffering through a drought. And by choosing to move away from their stable, solid, forever, traditional home, they picked up and moved to a different place and found the spring that brought them eternal life. because they were willing to break away from the past. Is that a familiar tale to us in regards to what Kunstler House and the Vienna Secessionists were all about? They kept on pounding this issue over and over and over again, and really emphasizing how they were different from Kunstler House and how they were all about being new and fresh and different. So that's the story behind Versacrum. And yes, it was a publication that was new and edgy, and they were constantly changing out the printing specs and the parameters of their publications, and no two issues looked alike, and every aspect of the issue was completely designed all over again every time they did it. The only thing that stayed was the outside format, which was almost square in size, and the name, Versacrum. Otherwise, everything changed out every single issue, and it came out a new issue every month. So they were, like, again, ahead of their time. I'm going to turn this on. Kelly, would you mind getting our lights for us? So just as a little refresher, the Vienna Secession didn't stay forever. It only lasted for about 5 or 6 years. But there was a faction that broke off called the Vienna Workshop, in which the artists that were there were crafting and making furnishings, much like the arts and crafts movement was doing. In their particular case, their attempt at total environment was one where they incorporated total work of other people. So they weren't necessarily designing whole rooms or whole spaces, but they were incorporating all designers into one piece. So this was their own take on it. So when they were designing their pieces, they weren't afraid to have 3 or 4 people working on a piece at the same time. So somebody here might have been very good at metal crafting. Another person might have been able to make all of the tops that are made out of ivory or ebony on these. And somebody else might have done the ultimate design or created the design for this. So they might have 2, 3, 4, 5 names on any given piece. And they were not opposed to doing design of all sorts. So they could do furniture design, or they could do jewelry, or they were doing all kinds of silversmithing and so on. So they were very ahead of their times. And when we think about this coming from 1900, over 100 years ago, and thinking about how the Victorian designs were looking and how that was still prevalent in this time, and compare that to what these guys were doing, you can see that these guys were very ahead of the game as far as using geometric form and modern designs. This is very modern. And they too were influenced by these guys, which is the Glasgow 4 and Charles Rennie Mackintosh.
Yeah, they make a mold and pour it in, or they like sort of hand.
It's still handmade.
Okay.
They were not, unlike William Morris, who was very upset about the fact that he couldn't make his pieces cost effective. The Vienna Secessionists, or actually the Vienna Workshop, said hooey on that. They said it is the price that it needs to be. And what we're doing is we're contributing to art, making these pieces available for people to see by having Vienna Workshop exhibitions, so people can come in and see these like they would walk through a museum. And so they have access to a work, even if it's not something that they can purchase themselves. They can still see these designs and be influenced and inspired by them. So that was their answer to what William Morris came across when he couldn't make the pieces affordable to other people. These guys said, well, we were going to make them visible, at least to other people. And as I said, the Vienna Secessionists and Workshop folks were very largely inspired by the next group that we're going to talk about, the Glasgow 4. As was mentioned before, these are 4 young designers that came from Glasgow, Scotland. They were comprised of 2 men, Charles Rennie Mackintosh and James Herbert McNair. And the style of these 2 men was somewhat like this. It was very tied to symbolic imagery. So we see metaphors being used, a lineup of babies at the foot of this woman, and these kind of ghostly apertures that are around the figure. Even the frame that's around it has got very organic nature to it, and this was imbued with meaning to Herbert McNair when he created this painting. his style very much mirrored the style of two other people that were going to school at the Glasgow School of Art at the same time. Charles and James were already working professionals, so they were taking night classes to expand their knowledge, to expand their education. These two women, Margaret MacDonald and Frances MacDonald, two sisters, were taking classes to potentially build careers for themselves. So they were older at this time. We had quite a conversation about women and the times of the Victorian age and how women were finding that it was much more difficult to find marriageable men to hook up with, and so they started to find other ways to amuse and occupy themselves, knowing that they probably were never going to have husbands or children in their lifetime. So going to school, getting an education was one way that they were doing this. Women were also starting to think about doing things like having careers. So these two women had done that. Their style, very much like what James Herbert McNair was doing, these elongated figures, babies at the foot of this woman, the framing around the image, and the very long rectangular images. So once the headmaster of the school saw the style of these two women, saw the style of the two men, he suggested that they get together and start doing collaborative works, and that's exactly what happened. This was a collaborative work between McNair and the two MacDonald sisters. And then we can also see that that same style is applied when Charles Rennie Mackintosh was doing posters also. So together, the four of them started to get together and work on pieces collaboratively. The two women went on to have a modestly successful graphics career for themselves. And we can see some pieces that they designed. The thing about what they were doing, though, is a lot of people considered their style, especially in Glasgow, they didn't really like it that much. And anybody want to guess why they were kind of opposed to the style? It has absolutely nothing to do with them being in Glasgow, but everything to do with the way, the shapes, and all of that stuff that they created. What's your impression of this stuff, Jessica?
It doesn't look human enough.
Yeah, yeah. A lot of people call what they were doing spook art, as in ghosts, spook. And it was because they had elongated these figures so long, and their bodies were so long and skinny that they looked like they were ghostly in the way that they were depicted, almost gaunt in the way that they were drawn, and certainly not in proportions of real human beings. We're going to talk about that as we get into the Japanism, a style called Japanism that was also prevalent at this time. But in any case, the two sisters in their career, they went on and did a number of things together. Posters, this one was considered a very successful poster for an umbrella company. My question to you guys is, where's the umbrella?
It's a trick question.
How do we know where the umbrella is? Yes?
It's like kind of like that figure that's like in between the two. Like you can kind of see it.
Okay, so
Oh, it's like a little like half.
it's actually behind her head.
Yeah.
If you look up
I
where her
see.
head is, she's holding an umbrella, and it's
Okay.
right next to her head. So yes, this is an ad for umbrella, for selling umbrellas, and it's promoting the umbrella factory itself, Druco, as the name of the company. And people consider this a very, very successful ad for the company. But by today's standards, we would call this not successful because we can't really see the umbrella too much. What do you think was successful in their time? What do you think, Jessica?
Because it drew everyone's attention.
How?
Because you don't really see that every day.
Okay, all right. Anybody want to elaborate on that a little bit?
I think there's some psychology behind this one too.
Okay.
I guess it has something to do with how like the human eye likes symmetry or circular objects, and it's I guess, call it framing or composition, but kind of how it sort of draws your eye around, it sort of points your eye where to go exactly.
Right.
It'll start you up top, and your eyes sort of fall down the rest of the figure, and see the name at the end.
Yeah, so there's good eye movement in this poster. The thing that's interesting about it to me, there's a number of things that are interesting, but the thing that's interesting to me is that compositionally, it's divided into thirds. We can see a third here, a third here, a third here, and so it's very symmetrical in that way. But the direction that they're moving your eye on this is very asymmetrical. So we've got a very heavy anchoring over on this side. The face is looking off into this direction, so our eye moves in this direction as a result of that face going in that direction. We end up with this white space, or a lot of white space over on this side. So to me, that's, it's a contrast between symmetry and asymmetry that's going on in this particular poster. So that framing is really nice. And again, like what we were seeing in some of those other posters when we looked at the Vienna Secessionist posters, when we looked at the posters, when we talked about the poster of Margaret and Francis and Herbert, they had this anchoring device. Charles Rennie Mackintosh had this anchoring device at the bottom of the page. So they're using the same elements over and over again. And again, tied to those Vienna Secessionist posters, very long and rectangular in the way that it's composed. But there's another reason why this drew so much attention, and it was simply because it was, as just pointed out, so very different from everything else of the time. Now, by today's standards, we would consider this not successful because it's so obscured that we don't see the umbrella. But this is a different time. People are not in a rush, racing to get from place to place to place like we are now, where we have to get the message across just like that. We're not in a car driving by this on the highway. The folks that were seeing this would have been walking along the sidewalk and going, that's interesting. That's very interesting. And they would have taken some time to study it and to look at it a little bit. It's the same kind of attitude that the Vienna Secessionists had when they were creating their posters. They were purposely choosing to make it different, to stand apart from what the rest of society's posters were like at that time. And by doing that, they drew more attention to it. So they were working successfully. However, not a lot of people in Glasgow really liked their work. And I'll talk about that a little bit more as we move on. As sisters, though, they did some really interesting stuff, and they didn't just work in graphic design, but they were also doing fabric design, tapestries and fabric work, and they also did paintings like this. And they had this technique that some people still don't know how they did this. It was a technique where they had this three-dimensionality to this gesso effect that they had. So the paintings were very large, like twice as large as what we see here. And every place where we see these linear qualities, it was raised on the surface. And then there was kind of like a stucco-ish finish to it also. So it was also felt very old, but very modern simultaneously. And again, this is all imbued with a lot of symbolism in the work. Their successes as artists was, again, worked its way outside of Scotland itself. The folks at the Vienna Secession saw their work and they were gobsmacked. They loved their stuff, and they invited the Glasgow Four to come and speak to them many times. So they came to Vienna many times to speak. A lot of their work was published through other publications. Versailles was one of them. There are many others that were powerful magazines that were reprinting their work also. But in Glasgow, not so famous, not so well known. Probably the best thing that they did, though, was to do a design collaboratively in Glasgow. I forgot to mention that the two women and the two men enjoyed working with each other so much that they started to pair off. And so Margaret and Charles, they ended up getting together, and Francis and Herbert ended up getting together. So they formed two married couples as well as four independent designers. So Margaret and Charles, they became a couple, and Herbert and Francis, they became a couple. So that whole idea of not finding a spouse that actually turned around. They found their spouses through their school. As collaborators, they were invited to participate in a competition. And the competition was one that was conducted by the school that they had gone to, the Glasgow Institute of Art. And the Glasgow Institute of Art decided that they were going to build a brand new building for the school. It's kind of like, okay, Tri-C decided that they were going to rip down the campus that we're on right now and build a whole new building. They invited these four designers to compete on who was going to win that commission. Imagine that. That's a really big commission. And as former students, like if you graduated and you were invited to come back and design for Tri-Seed, you would jump on it, right? Well, they did, and they won that commission. So that became their really big claim to fame. And so they ended up rebuilding or redesigning the Glasgow Institute of Art. And this is what it looked like when they were all done with it. Now, we look at this and we go, wow, that looks like a really old building. Looks like a really old building. Looks like a really old building. It was intentional. It was intentional that they were doing this. And if we think back to what Wayne Morris did when he built Red House, he knew what the style was of the period. He knew what Victorian style architecture looked like, and he wanted to have nothing to do with it. So instead, he built a house that looked like an old castle left over from the medieval times, and complete with all of the juttings and the parts of the structure that came out and moved forward and moved back as if there were rooms that were tacked onto the rooms. Same thing with these guys. They wanted the building to look old. They wanted it to look medieval. They were inspired by what they were seeing out in the countryside in Scotland, and they wanted to do this again, to the point where they chose a stone that was very, very porous in a time where industrialization was at its peak, which means that pollution was at its peak. So by using sandstone on this building, sandstone absorbs everything. And that meant that the building got very dark and bleak very quickly. And that tied to what they were trying to do. But if we look at this also from the perspective of modernity, we can start to see that there were some really modern things that were attached to this building, like the windows, for example. Old castles did not have these industrial kind of windows that we're seeing in this space. They didn't have the windows that crept up in the foyers to march up multiple flights up into the space. And wrought iron was still relatively new. They used these decorative elements on the exterior of the building that were made out of wrought iron, a newish material on the exterior of the building, and they fashioned that wrought iron in very modern ways. So the interior spaces were this kind of contrast between the industrial spaces and these ancient medieval looking spaces. So the contrast between the idea of this bright skylight with open windows above contrasting with these beams that look like they're hand hewn was really a counter to each other, modern versus old fashioned. And once they started to do this, they didn't stop with just the exterior of the buildings. They actually played with the interior of the buildings too, creating all of the furnishings within the building, creating all the lights, the chairs, the furniture, so creating, again, a total work of art, total environment in what they were doing. Coffered ceilings, everything had a very old feeling, but it was also mixed with a feeling of modernness. So over and over again, we have examples inside this interior space where it feels like it's got old stuff that's tied together with new stuff. Now, sadly, as I mentioned, the Glasgow Fort did not really make a good impression in Glasgow itself. The folks of Glasgow didn't like their stuff. There was other places that really admired what they were doing. And so they weren't getting a lot of commissions. In fact, when Herbert and Francis were offered teaching positions in England, in Liverpool actually, they decided to go and do that. So they moved away. The Glasgow Four split up, and the two couples went their merry ways. Herbert and Francis, again, went on to teach at an art institute in Liverpool. Unfortunately, this was the best of their work. The stuff that they had done as the Glasgow Four was the best of their work. They never really advanced to the same level that they did as teachers as what they did when they were independent designers. And sadly, they kind of faded away. It's reported that Frances committed suicide because she was heartbroken that she could not have children. So she was very, very sad that she never would have children and felt like a part of her life was missing, and so she committed suicide. Herbert ended up in his sadness, in his devastated state, he ended up taking all of the things that he had of her artwork and burned them. So we never saw what her work was like after she moved away. We have no examples of her work. He burned his own stuff as well. So we don't know what they did, which is sad. But Charles and Margaret, they went on to do a few other projects. They really did had very few commissions, but they were able to do a couple of things that gave them some muster, that kept them going. One of those things that they did was to design tea rooms for a woman named Catherine Cranston, in which they designed not only the rooms themselves, but also the furnishings in the space. Catherine Cranston loved their stuff, and so she chose them to design several tea houses of hers in Scotland and Glasgow at that time. So there were about 4 or 5 tea rooms that they designed, including one called the Willow, which is where a particular font comes from that is still used today. You might see it in for the opening credits for American Horror Story. It's the same font as what these guys were using for a lot of their stuff. So let me just ask you this. Let me show you this space that they designed, and let me tell you a little bit about the spaces. They designed spaces that were separated into lots of little different compartments. So they had a woman's tea room, a men's tea room, a communal tea room. They had a restaurant. They had a men's billiard section, and they had a shop all within this tea house that they designed. And they designed all the aspects of the tea house: windows, the furniture. They even went so far as to design the silverware that was on the table. They designed, I'll go back to this, the uniforms that the staff wore. They obviously designed the menus and so on. So that was really like their big claim to fame. It was these tea rooms that they designed, and again, the furniture that they did was really unique and very forward thinking for its time. It's interesting that they were designing tea rooms because this is telling us something about the era. Can anybody guess here why Miss Cranston was successful as a tea room operator, and why that would have been an important part of life in this period of time?
Because of saloons or salons? Maybe?
Because of the saloons or the salons, you mean?
Yeah.
Not saloons.
Sorry, I can't, it mixes those two up, I'm sorry.
Salons. Yeah, so it's kind of the same thinking as the salons. Anybody else have anything to say about that?
I just sort of goes back to the old like tea with the queen. It's sort of the whole like English culture of tea.
Yeah, tea was very, very important for these
Social
guys.
hub.
But it was really important for women, this idea of the tea rooms. Why?
Social networking. You want to meet a guy or something, I guess probably all that.
But think about the times. Think about the times that they were living in. How did women meet men? What was the typical way that women were supposed to meet men?
Arranged marriage.
What's that?
Arranged. They told you in arranged marriages back then, or okay.
Yeah. So this is really kind of indicative of how things were progressing, because if we go back 20 years from this to like a generation prior to what was happening here with Miss Cranston's tea rooms, women were expected to be introduced to men through social contacts that were arranged by her mother. So if you were a young woman, you would not have gone to a tea room. You would have been going to people's personal homes by invitation for afternoon parties or whatever, socials, or they would have salons in their own homes, and they would have conversations and so on, but you'd have to be invited to them, and it was always chaperoned. There were always like lots of people around watching. Now, we're moving into a time where women are stepping out on their own. They're not waiting to be invited to some social gathering. They're going out and meeting people, but they're doing so in a way that is public. So by going into a tea room, there's absolutely no chance that there's going to be any hanky-panky going on in public setting like a tea room. And it's totally fine because you're there in front of everybody. Everybody can witness what's going on at your table. You're still socializing with other people, but you're also socializing with potential mates through this. So this is one way that women started to push against the norms, the traditions of the times before by choosing to go out on their own, without a chaperone, without an escort, by arranging to have lunch with somebody, to arrange to meet somebody for tea. It was all above board and it all felt socially okay. And so this is, again, a turning point. We're starting to see women becoming more and more assertive about their own choices, their own lives, how their lives are going to be run. So Miss Cranston's tea rooms are really an example of how things were changing. So here we have, again, total work of art, total environment, and that's how this ties together into arts and crafts. You'll notice that the style that's being created here looks nothing like Morris's recliner chair. It looks nothing like the furnishings that he was creating that were very medieval looking. This does not look medieval anymore. But the idea of that total environment and controlling and making things by hand, that still pervades in all of the stuff that he's doing, that is being done here. One more person that's associated with the arts and crafts movement is a guy named Peter Behrens. He was German. And he was, again, another young designer. He was actually very hip in his time. He was considered what they would call bohemian. Has anybody ever heard that term before?
Yeah.
It's bohemian. What does it mean to be bohemian?
Doesn't it mean like earthy or something?
Sort of earthy. Anybody else? Bohemian.
I'm not sure what the reference is. I don't want to say a hippie, but like.
That's probably the closest.
Okay, all right, thanks. I was just like.
Bohemian is kind of like hippie-ish. It's like, okay, extreme, avant-garde, pushing the sense of propriety. Still living in that culture, but actually pushing the edges of what that culture will accept. So that's bohemian. That's what we call bohemian. And so Peter Behrens was definitely considered bohemian for his time. But he was also really, really talented, and so people recognized him as being talented and invited him to do things that would capitalize on his artistic talents. One of the things that was happening at this time were changes in living structures. And again, just pointing out, he's from Germany, and Germany itself was trying to be considered one of the most forward, progressive kind of thinkers in the world. This is before we get to World War I, certainly before we get to World War II. They've won the Franco-Prussian War. They're trying to expand their territories. They want to be seen as a world power, and they want to be thought of as very intellectually above everybody else. So there are a lot of people in the government that were trying to make Germany look really good. And one of the people that was part of the government was some Grand Duke who decided that he was going to fund a living situation that would have shown a utopian style of living. This is also before we get to the Russian Revolution, before we have any examples of what communism really is. And all we have are books that are written by people like Karl Marx, who espouse this idea of everybody sharing, everybody living in the same spaces, and everybody having equal say in, or equal recognition in what they were doing. And that's kind of what the Vienna Workshop was doing. They were trying to give everybody equal credit in the works that were being created. Nobody had anything bad to say about this. It seemed like it was very utopian, very idealized, and so there was a lot of experimentation that was going on this time for small groups of people to get together and to prove this communist model would work, including the group that formed and invited Peter Behrens to join. It's called the Darmstadt Colony. And the Darmstadt Colony was indeed a group of artists that were all living in a communal society Each one had their own houses, but they were sharing in the labors of making food, of building furniture, of creating art together, and just living in the same environment together. This group hired or brought in among their members the same guy, just Maria Ulbrich, who designed the Vienna Secession building. So if you remember what that looked like, this very stark building with the gold inlay and the Greek elements in it. He was brought in to design many of the buildings, and he did. He designed almost all of the buildings, except for one, Peter Behrens' house. Peter Behrens decided that he did not want to have a house, I'm sorry, this isn't showing Peter Behrens' house, but Peter Behrens decided that he didn't want to have the same house as everybody else. He wanted to have his own individual house. And it wasn't that he was being snotty about it. It was that he really wanted to experiment and learn how to do this craft of architecture. And so here's like an example of one of his earlier pieces. But when he was offered this opportunity to come to the Darmstadt colony, he worked it in so that they would let him build his own house. So he did. This is what his house looked like. And it was meant to be a kind of a forward-thinking version of what a traditional German-style house, stucco house with in Tudor and fashion, with the old-fashioned kind of roof line and all of that. But it was laid out in a way that was very modern in the way it was done. He designed all aspects of the house. So here's the front door to the house, and we saw like there's kind of like this contrast between this old-fashioned kind of stucco-y Tudor-style house, and then this interior that's the door frame that's very kind of modern.
Art Deco almost.
Art Nouveau.
Oh, that, okay, thank you.
Yeah, in the way that it's constructed. And he didn't just stop there. He went on to design all aspects of the house, including the interior spaces. So everything that we see in this picture was something that he designed. He designed that break front, he designed the table, he designed the coffering in the ceilings, he designed the lamps, he designed all of the teacups, he designed the carpet, he designed all the things that were in this room. And so we can start to see that his style was pervading. The house was laid out in a really wild way. In the basement was the kitchen, on the top floors were the bedrooms, the living room and the dining room were in between levels. So it's strange to have a kitchen that was on the ground and subfloor, but that's the way that he designed it. And again, he designed all of the pieces that went into the house, including all of the dishware. Yes, Jessica.
Is it bad when I first saw the living room, or not the living room, the dining room, and I saw the room, like, that must be a pain in the butt to clean. Like, if you drop, like, any food on that.
Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily put a great big shaggy rug like that under my dining room table, but that was how he did it. So he stayed on at the Darmstadt colony and did collaborative pieces with other artists and designers there. And this was one thing that he did, but somewhere along the line, he was actually asked to teach at an art school in Dusseldorf. And so he went on to become the headmaster at the school there. So in 1903, he became the director of the Dusseldorf School of Arts and Crafts. And there he fell under the influence of another German named J.L. Laurick. You don't need to know his name, but Laurick was one of the teachers there, and he was one of the first people to actually think about designing with grids. Nobody before this time had actually considered the idea of creating an underlying structure to the things that they were doing. And Laurick really felt like there was something about this new geometric reforms that we were starting to see in the Vienna Secessionists. He was really intrigued with the idea of having underlying structure to anything that he did. So in his classes, he taught grid structure, and he used structures like these. And Peter Behrens saw these, and he fell in love with this. And so he started to incorporate this idea of the grid structure in all the things that he did. Later on, still while he was the director of the Dusseldorf School of Art, he actually got another commission. He was asked to design all of the pieces for an electric company called the AEG, or actually the name at the top here, Allgemein, I can't even say that. But we can break that down to AEG and call it the electric company. It's kind of the same thing as General Electric is to us today. It was a very major electric company. They not only supplied electricity, but they also made electronic products. And so Peter Behrens went on to design all of the pieces for the company. Now, he never actually was an employee there. He was hired as a designer, a freelance designer, to do all of their pieces, but they had trusted him so implicitly that they let him do everything. So he not only designed posters for them, but he designed their logo, he designed their factory building, he designed print pieces, and he designed things for sale. So in all of these things, we can start to see that there's a similarity between them. And one of those similarities is the font that he used. This font was one that he designed himself, and it was kind of a cross between, or was meant to be a cross between serif and sans serif. We can see that, especially here in the letter E, that the thicks and thins are pretty even across the board. It doesn't feel like there's big contrast between the thicks and the thins. And then the serifs are very tiny, very, very small, very nuanced in the way that they're done. So he was trying to pull together old ideas into this modernity of, again, sans serif type, which really hadn't been used much yet. Sans serif was still just catching on. Peter Behrens was one of the first people to actually capitalize on using sans serif for body copy, for large amounts of copy. Nobody had really done this before him. But in any case, the font that he chose here is a serif font, but it's not quite as extreme as most serifs. The other thing that we notice about this logo is the beehive shape, the honeycomb shape of this. And he applied this in many different places, including on the facade or the structure of the factory building that he did. So you can see that it's got the logo at the very tippy top of the building, but the roof line itself is also kind of emblematic of that honeycomb shape. Why do you think a honeycomb was so important in the shape for this factory?
It's actually its design structure. It's very strong. Like, I mean, modern interpretations, like they make like composite honeycomb. They make like airplanes and race cars out of a similar structure. It's very strong. It's lightweight too.
It's even more than that. Courtney, any ideas? Wake you up here on why a honeycomb was so important. I know, Jessica, you want to answer the question. Throw it out to other people though too. Christopher, any ideas?
No.
Anybody else have thoughts on why a honeycomb was telling in this? Taylor.
Oh, I get it. I know.
Honeycomb signify unity or something?
Yeah, think about how bees interact with each other.
Bingo.
It's a communal society, right? Everybody is equal except for the queen. Queen is above everybody else, but all the worker bees are all equal to each other. There's some drones that are set aside. They're, propagating the hive, but otherwise everybody is working equally.
It's like a metaphor for communism.
It is, but again, we don't have any bad examples of communism going astray yet.
Right.
So that Darmstadt colony was very, very successful.
Right.
They were looking at this and going, communism works, this is great. And Peter Behrens is saying when he's designing this and using this as a logo, that communism is great, this is all working really well. And we can see, again, that grids that were created by J.L.L. Malrick are at work here in the stuff that he's doing for the company. And the idea of this honeycomb shape just keeps on appearing over and over and over again in the stuff that he's doing. Subtle, it's not oblique, it's actually, kind of like a metaphorical, but all the same, it's there in the things that he's doing. It becomes kind of the brand or the identity for this company. To the point that now we look back at what Peter Behrens was doing, and we consider him one of the first ones to actually design a whole branding system. And people say that he was the father of the corporate identity program. So he was very unique in that way as well. He went on and did a lot more projects like this, but these few projects that I pointed out to you kind of show that he was, again, thinking about the total environment in developing these branding schemes and developing his house for the Darmstadt colony by having students working on a grid that was an underlying structure that repeats over and over and over again and gets utilized in all of the pieces that they're doing. So, Peter Behrens, very important. And then we move into Art Nouveau, and we start to recognize when we look at aspects of Art Nouveau, or just even the idea of symbolism, how they're tying into some of the designs that we were looking at with the Glasgow Four, with some of the stuff that Peter Barris was doing. This is a piece designed by a guy named Jan Terroup, and here's another one that he did. And what we can see in these pieces, the similarity in them, is this idea of creating figures that are not based upon reality, that they're, again, very elongated, that they're metaphorical, that there is symbolism at work in these pieces. Symbolism was at its peak as we get into the 1880s, 1890s, all the way into 1900. People were using symbolic measures or some metaphoric representations and the things that they were doing to represent changes in the world. Here, Terroup is using them to symbolize the idea of metaphysical, of what happens after we die. And if we think about this era and how extreme things were, how the world was changing, we can see why this was really popular. We've entered a period of time where machines and advances in technology have made things so much different than they had been just 100 years in the past, that inventions were making it possible for people to question things that they had never done before. Just like when Gutenberg developed printing and the Bible started to be printed, people started to question the Catholic Church, or the Christian Church at that time, and then created factioning. Well, the same thing was happening now with industrialization and with the creation of machines and new advances happening in technology. Now, it's not just the machines anymore, but things are being created that have never happened before. Telescopes among them, microscopes among them. So now people are starting to look out into the heavens and recognize that the stuff that they see up in the skies is not just bright lights up there, but there's planets, and that there are other solar systems, and there are other galaxies, and there are places that go beyond our understanding what had existed before that time. And it wasn't just little blinking lights that were attributed to God, but now we can see them. Same thing with the microscope. We can look into a microscope, look down at things that we thought were invisible before. But now we can start to see microbiology, and we can see the beginnings of understanding viruses and germs and illness and things that can kill people. They're starting to be able to recognize that there's a reason why people are dying from cholera. It has absolutely nothing to do with God being mad at you. It has everything to do with the bacteria or the diseases that are floating around in the water systems and how they get polluted. And once you start to take away the mystery of these things and you start to attribute them to something like science rather than to God, then you start to question God altogether. And that's what was happening here. People were starting to question God. Well, if God isn't responsible for this and he's not responsible for that, then does he even exist? What happens when we die? If God doesn't exist, what happens when we die? Oh my God, is that the end? And so people started to question this and started to wonder, is there life after death? And if there is, what does it look like? And so you start to see this, pick up in the number of seances and people starting to believe in mystical things and ghosts. And again, people are starting to think about things in ways that they have never considered thinking about them before. And that's showing up in the art. We see these artists that are playing with us and starting to look at things in very new and kind of spooky ways. That's why the spook style of the Glasgow Four was really, for some people, it was very jarring, but it was actually speaking to something that was happening at this time. The other thing that we noticed about these paintings is kind of a flatness to what's happening here. And this is something that if we look back on what William Morris was doing, starting from 1860s on forward, he was creating flatness too, and the stuff that he was, the tapestries and the fabric coverings that he was creating, they're all very flat. They were not dimensional, which was the norm of the Victorians. He was doing things that were really had no perspective to them. And we can see here that we've got these hard outlines and these very flattened shapes that are happening in this painting from the 1890s. This is not by accident, and it's not just because this guy is trying to imitate what William Morris was doing. William Morris is trying to imitate something else, and that's called Japanism. Japanism. So, based upon Japanese art. So why Japanism? Why did Japanese art suddenly become really, really popular? Yes.
I feel like it kind of like reflected that like not the Victorian, Renaissance art that they liked so much.
Okay.
They used a lot of white space and it was like really light colors.
Okay. All right. That's one thing. Yes.
There's certain sense of realism to it as well.
There is. There's still realism in it. And again, if we go backwards, I'm sorry, I have to go backwards for a second here. If we go backwards here, we can see that there's elements of realism here, but it's also very flat. The idea of flattening it takes away some of the realism to it, so we don't necessarily see shadows happening in the figures here. Again, if we went back and we looked at what William Morris was doing, we'd recognize that he wasn't playing with shadows either. He was taking away that aspect of shadows and dimensionality in the stuff that he was doing. Now, William Morris, when he was doing this, he was, again, doing something that was very fresh and new at his time. He stopped relying upon real objects in front of him and drawing real objects as he saw them. He started doing them from his memory or from his imagination. And that's what these guys are doing. They're doing things from their memory or imagination. Nobody before in the history of art, before the 1860s, was doing this. They were all using real objects in front of them, sketching them, drawing them, creating art based upon reality. Now the artists are starting to push away from that and doing things that are based upon their own imagination. And this becomes very, very important as we start to move into Art Nouveau, this idea of doing things that are conceived in our heads. And it's partly because of this, because of the Japanese art that was happening. There was a proliferation in Europe, starting from 1860 and moving on forward, of Japanese art. Why? Yeah.
Industrial Revolution, I mean, you had Japan sort of come alive as was it an empire? Yet back then it was trying to be one, and they went and modernized, and then they were able to travel, and then...
There's a real story behind this.
Okay,
it's in your book. It's in your book.
Right.
There's a real history to this, and that's what I'm trying to get to. I appreciate your guessing at that, but there's a real reason for it. Anybody get to that point in their book?
Samurai warrior culture.
It had been a samurai warrior culture. So, the story is that in the 1850s, 1860s, prior to the 1850s, 1860s, Japan had created an isolationist society. They didn't want to have anything to do with the rest of the world. That's not to say that they didn't know about the rest of the world, because when the Portuguese and others started circumnavigating the globe, they came to Japan. And that was their ultimate goal, was to get to Japan, get to India, get to the Far East, and to start trading with China and all these other countries in the Far East. That was why Marco Polo and all of those guys were trying to get around the world to get to those goods. So the Japanese had met with these European traders, these European travelers, and they decided that they didn't want to have anything to do with them. Why? Jessica?
If I remember correctly, they were trying to spread the religion and they didn't like that.
Yeah, they hated European religion. They thought that it was totally against everything that they thought, and they did. They had a totally different god system than what the Europeans had. So that was one thing that they did. They also thought that they were very vulgar, that the Europeans didn't bathe very often. It was the common practice back in those days that if you took a bath, it was like once a year. Seriously, once a year. They thought that the dirt on your skin was protecting you from disease. So most people did not take baths. They were very, very scummy, very, very dirty. It was just horrible to think about it now, but they did not bathe their bodies. And so you can imagine what it would have been like to meet somebody that was like that. They smelled to there. And their way that they ate, and their table manners, and all of the things that they were introducing into Japan, the Japanese just thought they were horrendous. The Japanese bathed daily, that was part of their culture, to bathe daily. And not just to bathe, but they had a whole ritual to bathing. So there was like a structure to how this went, and to have clean clothing, and to eat food that was artful in the way that it was created. All of this was part of Japanese tradition, and the Europeans came in there and they were eating with their hands, and they didn't bathe, and they smelled bad, and they didn't change their clothing, and all of that stuff. They just thought that they were repulsive. So they didn't want to have anything to do with it. So they shut off borders. Part of that too was the way that the government started to work in that time. So Japan, through this isolationist policy, they created something called the shogunate, which was a military rule of government. And the shoguns took power, so they had taken over from what it had been. Before, in the times when Japan had open borders, there was trade from Japan to China to Korea to Vietnam to India to all of these places that were part of the Far East. And so the Japanese would trade one thing, and they would get vegetables from China, or they would get beef from India or someplace. It didn't really matter. There was just like this open trade that was going on. They were trading goods back and forth. But when Japan said, nope, not going to do it anymore, it changed their entire economy. And they had to be self-reliant in their economy, which meant that now anybody that had farmland in Japan was considered elite, because there was no other farmland that they could go to. There was no other place that was raising vegetables. So if you were somebody that actually owned some land and you could grow vegetables, then you would have been seen as, oh my God, you're the only one. And you can demand any price that you want for these vegetables. And that's what happened. So the economy turned around from one where cities and from merchants in cities that used to sell things from other places had been at the higher part of society. Now they suddenly went down because there was nothing to trade. And the folks that had lived out in the countryside and that had farms, now they were considered part of the elite. And this is part of the change that had happened as part of this shogunate culture that was developed. But further than that, the shogunate decided that they did not want these two parts of society to cross-melt. They were afraid that the merchants were going to try to take over where the farmers were at. And they were very in favor of what the farmers were doing, and they wanted to keep them at the highest part of society. So they made it a law that if you were a merchant in the city, you were not allowed to talk to a farmer. Period. That was the rule. Not allowed. So what they had to do was they had to get inventive in how they did this. And one of the ways that they did was through these people, geishas. So this, let me just go back to this isolationist policy, because I kind of brushed over that. The decision on the part of the Japanese to close down their harbors made it possible for Japan to stay isolated like this, but it also meant that they went behind as far as technology goes. They were not keeping up with the same great technologies that were happening through Europe, including the manufacturing of guns and weaponry, which the Europeans had started to excel at. So by the time you get to the 1850s, there are war ships and armored ships and cannon fire and very big guns on these ships. Now, everybody knew that Japan had isolated themselves, but they also knew that Japan had some really great pieces, gold among them, and silk that they had, that the Europeans still wanted to have access to. And especially in America felt like they were very left out of this world power kind of grab that was going on. Britain, France, Germany were all kind of like crowding in. They were taking over parts of Africa, and they were taking over parts of the Middle East. And so those had all become really populated by the Europeans, and the Americans had nothing. So they sent in one of their best admirals, Commodore Perry, and they sent him in, and they said, Admiral Commodore Perry, they sent him in, or is it the other? I forget. Anyhow, Perry went in, and they sent him in, and they said, force an agreement with the Japanese. And so he did. He went to Japan. At first, he sent out his emissaries and said, we would really like it if you would trade with us. And the Japanese said, nope, not going to do it. Not interested, not at all. And so Commodore Perry lined up his warships along the harbor in Edo, Japan, which is now Tokyo. And I think that's right, no, Kyoto, no, Edo. Lined them up there and threatened to blow the smithereens out of the city. And fortunately for them, they didn't have to actually do this because there were a lot of people that were really tired of this shogunate domination in government. And so the shogunate government said, we surrender, and they immediately opened up their ports and formed treaties with the U.S. And that treaty didn't last long as just a U.S. treaty. It also opened up to the Europeans. So the Europeans started to come in. And once they did that, then the Europeans started to buy goods from Japan, and they started to see all kinds of stuff that were coming out of Japan. Jessica, did you have anything to say? You started to raise your hand before, and I cut you off.
I remember there was a history lesson that one of the people that ran one of the territories still had his borders open, so he can trade with the outside nations. So that way,
There were that I think that
I'm trying to remember his
it was
name.
either
but
the Dutch or the Portuguese that the Japanese
it was
still
the Dutch.
They were still trading with them, but very small amounts. Mostly they were allowing imports to come in, they were not allowing things to go out. So for the most part, Europe was not seeing what was happening in Japan. And Japan was creating work like this. They called these kinds of images ukiyo-es, and they were actually wood block prints that they would hand paint in, or they would so like the patterns that we're seeing here were actually hand painted into the spaces, and everything else would have been wood block printing. But they called these ukiyo-es, literally translated out to mean floating world. And when we look at these, we can start to recognize that there are elements here that remind us of things that are floating in space. For example, where's the horizon line? It doesn't exist. It's floating around in space. These plants are just kind of floating out here. And the woman is just kind of floating out here. And further, we can start to recognize that the perspective here is really kind of skewed. Just like we saw in the Tarub painting, just a couple of slides earlier, we see that we have these hard outlines, no shading, and again, this kind of floating in space, kind of idealized pictures that are going on. Further, the images of women in this were unique to the Europeans. These women, geishas, we're going to talk about them come Wednesday. So I want you to think about, to do a little research about geishas, make sure that you're doing your reading, and we're going to talk about how this woman, these women, changed the way that Europeans started